A widowed rancher desperate for milk for his newborn son opened his door during a blizzard, only to find the town's shunned outcast standing there, her own heart breaking but her body able to provide the one thing he needed to save his child. Wyoming Territory, December 1879. The wind was a predator. It stalked the plains, howling like a devil unchained, and its teeth were made of ice. This was the kind of winter that turned breath to frost and men to ghosts. It clawed at the worn edges of Caleb Stone's sprawling ranch, a vast and lonely kingdom of snow-drowned fences and shivering cattle. The wind rattled the windows of his great house, a place built of thick timber and cold sorrow, a monument to a life that had been stolen from him only 3 days prior. Inside, another storm raged. It was a silent, desperate tempest, contained within the heaving chest of a newborn infant. Caleb's son, a boy without a name, a boy whose first cries had been answered by the silence of his mother's death. Mary was gone. The fever that followed the birth had been a thief, swift and brutal, leaving Caleb with nothing but a gaping wound where his heart had been and this tiny, wailing life. He was a man who understood cattle, land, and the brutal arithmetic of survival. He could break a wild stallion and face down a blizzard that could split trees like matchsticks. But he could not quiet this child. He had tried everything. Watered down cow's milk, boiled and cooled. The baby had choked on it, his small face turning a terrifying shade of purple before he spat it all out. Sugar, water, broth, nothing worked. The boy was starving, his cries growing weaker, more pitiful, a sound that shredded what was left of Caleb's soul. His foreman Jade, a man with a face like a worn saddle, had ridden for the nearest town, 2 days away in this weather, in a desperate search for a wet nurse. But Caleb knew it was a fool's errand. The snow was a wall, white and endless. Jade would be lucky to make it back alive, let alone with help. Caleb stood by the cradle, a giant of a man rendered helpless. His hands, calloused and capable, trembled as he looked down at the fragile creature swaddled in wool. The boy was a ghost of Mary, with her dark hair and impossibly small features. He was all Caleb had left of her, and he was failing him. The fire crackled in the massive stone hearth, but its warmth could not touch the ice in his veins. He was alone, utterly, completely alone in a silent house with a dying child. A sudden violent banging on the main door cut through the infant's cries and the wind's shriek. It was a frantic, desperate sound. Caleb's first thought was of Jade, returned too soon, perhaps injured. He strode to the door, his movements heavy with exhaustion and dread, and wrenched it open. A blast of wind and snow surged into the hall, stealing his breath. And there, framed by the swirling white chaos, stood a wraith. It was Eliza Miller. He knew her as everyone in the valley did, the widow from the small, failing homestead on the edge of his property, the woman the townspeople whispered about, a pariah. Her husband had died a month ago, a fool who tried to cross the river during an early thaw. They said she was cursed. They said she was strange, too quiet, with eyes that held a sorrow too deep for a woman her age. She looked half frozen, her thin shawl crusted with ice, her face pale and gaunt. But it was her eyes that held him. They were wide with a fierce, desperate light, and he saw something else there, something he recognized in the mirror each morning. Grief, a raw, bottomless grief. "Mr. Stone," she stammered, her voice thin against the wind, her teeth chattering. Her gaze darted past him into the warm interior of the house, drawn by the sound of the baby's weak cry. He saw the front of her worn dress was damp even through the melting snow, a dark, circular stain over her chest. "I heard," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush, "in town before the storm hit. About your wife and the baby." She took a ragged breath, her eyes locking onto his. "My boy, he was born a week ago. The cold took him yesterday. He didn't survive the night." Caleb felt a jolt, a pang of shared agony that transcended his own suffocating despair. He saw the truth of her words in the hollowed-out landscape of her face. She looked down at her own chest, at the damp fabric of her dress. Her voice dropped to a whisper, filled with a pain so profound it was almost holy. "I have milk," she said. "It's a waste. It's a cruel, terrible waste. Please, Mr. Stone, let me help your son." For a long moment the world stood still. There was only the howl of the wind, the cry of a starving child, and the offer of a broken-hearted woman. It was a prayer answered in the most unexpected, tragic way imaginable. Caleb Stone, a man who had closed his heart to the world, stepped back and held the door open wider. He said nothing. He did not need to. He simply let her in from the storm. The great room of Caleb's house was a cavern of shadows and wealth. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hungry flames casting dancing light on dark wood, polished leather, and the mounted head of a great stag whose glass eyes stared blankly into the space. For Eliza, who had spent the last year in a one-room cabin with a dirt floor and a leaking roof, it felt like a cathedral. A cold, lonely cathedral. Caleb led her to the fire, his movements stiff and uncertain. He was a man accustomed to giving orders, not accepting help, especially from a woman like her, a woman from the very bottom rung of their small world. "Sit," he commanded, his voice a low rumble. It was not unkind, merely unused. He gestured to a large leather armchair near the hearth. Eliza obeyed, sinking into the chair. The warmth of the fire was a shock to her frozen limbs, a painful thawing that made her bones ache. She kept her thin shawl wrapped tightly around herself, a useless shield against the grandeur of the room and the magnitude of what she was about to do. He disappeared for a moment and returned with a heavy wool blanket, which he draped over her shoulders without a word. The gesture was so unexpected, so practical and yet so tender that it brought tears to her eyes. She blinked them back fiercely. She would not cry, not here. Then he brought the cradle and placed it on the floor beside her chair. Inside, the baby's cries had subsided to a series of wretched, hiccuping whimpers. His tiny face was pinched and pale, his lips tinged with blue. He was so small, so much smaller than her own robust boy had been. The thought was a fresh stab of pain, sharp and visceral. She had to force her gaze away from the child, to look up at the towering man who watched her with an unreadable expression. His face was hard, carved from the same granite as the mountains that surrounded his land, but his eyes held a desperate plea. "He will not take a bottle," Caleb stated, the words flat and heavy. "Nothing." Eliza nodded, her throat tight. She understood. A baby knew its mother. It knew the scent, the warmth, the heartbeat, and it knew the emptiness when all of that was gone. "May I?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. She gestured toward the cradle. He gave a short, sharp nod. With hands that trembled slightly, Eliza reached down and lifted the infant. He was lighter than a feather, a fragile bundle of bones and desperation. She settled him into the crook of her arm, her body instinctively knowing what to do. The muscle memory of motherhood was a cruel and beautiful thing. She looked at Caleb, a silent question in her eyes. He averted his gaze, turning his broad back to her and staring into the fire, granting her a privacy she hadn't known how to ask for. Her fingers fumbled with the buttons of her dress. The cold air hit her skin. She guided the baby's mouth to her breast, her heart pounding a painful rhythm against her ribs. For a terrible second, the baby did nothing, his lips slack. Eliza's breath hitched, then a flicker of instinct. His mouth opened, searching. He latched on, weak at first, then with a sudden, desperate strength. Eliza gasped, a sound that was half pain and half relief. The sensation was a bittersweet agony. It was the feeling that should have been for her Daniel, not for this stranger's child. But as the baby began to nurse, a quiet calm settled over her. The terrible, aching pressure in her chest began to ease. This was right. This was what her body was made for. It was a purpose in the midst of purposelessness. The baby suckled greedily, his tiny fists unclenching. A faint touch of pink returned to his cheeks. Eliza watched him, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a cold path down her face. She was saving this child, and in some small, inexplicable way, he was saving her. She was not just an empty vessel of grief. She was sustenance, she was life. Caleb remained by the fire, his back to them, a silent, unmoving sentinel. He did not turn around, not even when the only sounds in the room were the crackling of the logs, the rhythmic suckling of his son, and the soft, shuddering breaths of the woman who was keeping him alive. They stayed that way for a long time, two grieving souls bound together by a fragile new life, each lost in their own private winter. Outside, the blizzard raged on, but inside the great, lonely house, a fragile truce had been declared. An uneasy alliance was forged in silence and sorrow, a practical arrangement born of absolute necessity. The days that followed fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. The storm locked them inside the ranch house, cutting them off from the rest of the world. It became their entire universe, the roaring fire, the sleeping child, and the vast, silent spaces between them. Eliza moved into a small guest room near the nursery. It was a simple room, but to her it was luxurious, with a soft bed and clean sheets and a window that looked out onto an endless sea of white. She rarely left that wing of the house. Her world shrank to the needs of the infant. She named him in her own mind, Thomas. It was a good, strong name. It felt right. She would feed him, rock him, and sing him the same soft lullabies she had sung to the swell of her own belly. When he slept, she would sit by the window and watch the snow fall, her heart a hollow ache. Caleb was a ghost in his own home. He would appear at mealtimes, which they took in silence at opposite ends of a grand dining table long enough to host 20 people. He would bring her trays of food, leaving them outside her door as if she were a convalescent. He chopped wood, tended the fire, and vanished for long hours into his study, a room filled with books and maps and the scent of old leather and whiskey. But they observed each other. From across the long table, Eliza saw the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes. She saw the way his hands, so large and capable, would sometimes pause while holding a fork, his gaze lost in a memory. She saw the pain he tried so hard to bury beneath a mountain of stoicism. Caleb, from the shadows of his study, watched her. He saw the gentle way she handled his son, the quiet dignity in her movements. He noticed she never complained, never asked for anything. He saw the profound, bone-deep sadness in her eyes when she thought no one was looking, a reflection of his own. He heard her soft, humming lullabies drift down the hallway at night, a sound that was both comforting and heartbreaking. One evening, he found her in the kitchen, long after the cook had retired for the night. She was washing the baby's swaddling clothes in a basin of hot water, her back bent to the task. His staff was meant to do that. "Leave it," he said, his voice startling her. "The staff will see to it." She looked up, her hands submerged in the soapy water. "It is no trouble," she replied softly. "I like to have something to do with my hands." He stood there for a moment, watching the methodical way she worked. He saw the raw, chapped skin of her knuckles, the hands of a woman who had known nothing but hard labor. He thought of his Mary's hands, always soft, always smelling of lavender. The contrast was a fresh wave of grief. Without another word, he walked over to the basin, rolled up his own sleeves, and took a piece of wet cloth from her. He began to wring it out with a surprising efficiency. Eliza stared at him, shocked into silence. Caleb Stone, the master of this vast ranch, a man wealthier than anyone she had ever known, was washing his son's soiled linens beside her. They worked in silence, side by side. The only sounds were the sloshing of water and the snap of wet fabric. It was a small, mundane task, yet it felt monumental. It was the first thing they had ever done together, a shared chore that bridged the chasm of class and sorrow between them. When they were finished, he dried his hands and looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time. He saw not the town pariah, but a woman of immense, quiet strength. "Thank you, Eliza," he said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything he could not say. "Thank you for saving my son. Thank you for being here. Thank you for understanding a grief I cannot speak aloud." "He is a good baby," she answered, her gaze soft. "He has his mother's eyes." Caleb's throat constricted. He could only nod before turning and leaving the room, the unspoken emotion too heavy to bear. That small act of kindness was a seed. A few days later, Eliza found a new, thick wool dress laid out on her bed, a deep forest green. There was no note. The next day, a pair of sturdy, fleece-lined boots appeared outside her door. She, in turn, began leaving a plate of freshly baked bread on the table in his study late at night, knowing he often worked until the early hours. She mended a tear in his favorite coat, her stitches small and neat. They were small, non-verbal gestures, the language of two people who had forgotten how to speak of feelings. They were bricks, carefully laid, building a fragile bridge across the silent, lonely expanse that separated them. When the blizzard finally broke after 10 days, the world outside was reborn, pristine and blindingly white under a sharp winter sun. The silence of their isolation was shattered by the return of Jade and the ranch hands. And with them came the world. The whispers started almost immediately. The ranch hands, rough men loyal to Caleb, watched Eliza with a mixture of suspicion and grudging respect. They saw that the infant, now named Thomas by his father, was thriving, his cheeks round and pink. They saw the life in him, and they knew who had given it. But they also saw the widow, the outcast, living under their master's roof. Word traveled to the nearby town of Redemption with the first supply wagon. The news spread like wildfire through the small, judgmental community. Eliza Miller, the cursed widow, was living at the Stone Ranch. The townspeople, who had offered Caleb nothing but empty platitudes and useless advice, now clucked their tongues in sanctimonious disapproval. They painted the arrangement in the ugliest colors imaginable. They spoke of her in hushed, vicious tones in the general store and the saloon. Eliza felt their judgment like a physical blow when she accompanied Caleb to town for supplies. He had insisted she come, that she needed to get out of the house. The fresh air, he had said, but it was not fresh. It was thick with scorn. Women who had once offered her false sympathy after her husband's death now turned their backs on her in the street. Their gazes were cold, their lips pressed into thin, hard lines. Men looked at her with a leering curiosity that made her skin crawl. She pulled her shawl tighter, keeping her eyes fixed on the frozen ground, wishing she could disappear. Caleb saw it all. His face was a mask of cold fury. He walked beside her, a formidable presence, his hand resting almost protectively on the small of her back as he guided her through the hostile whispers. His silent defense was a shield, but the poison seeped through. The threat, however, soon took a more tangible form than gossip. It arrived in a polished black buggy, pulled by a matching pair of sleek black horses. It arrived in the form of Silas Croft. Croft was a banker from Cheyenne, a man who smelled of city money and ambition. He had been trying to buy up land in the valley for years, including the small parcel that had belonged to Eliza's husband. He had a reputation for being ruthless, a vulture who circled weakness. He had made offers on Caleb's land as well, offers Caleb had always flatly refused. He arrived at the ranch unannounced one afternoon, his smile as thin and cold as a razor's edge. He found Caleb on the porch, watching Eliza rock Thomas in the winter sun. "Stone," Croft said, his eyes flicking from Caleb to Eliza and the baby with undisguised contempt. "I came to offer my condolences, a terrible tragedy. But it seems you've found a creative solution to your domestic problems." Caleb's body went rigid. "Croft," he said, his voice dangerously low, "you are not welcome here. State your business and leave my property." Croft's smile widened. "My business is with the lady." He tipped his hat to Eliza, a mockery of politeness. "Mistress Miller, I was so sorry to hear of your recent troubles. First your husband, then your child, and now your homestead, which, according to my records, is on the verge of foreclosure." Eliza's blood ran cold. She had known it was coming. With her husband gone, she had no way to pay the bank loan he had taken out against their small plot of land. "I am prepared to be generous," Croft continued, his gaze sliding back to Caleb. "I will forgive the debt on your little farm, Mistress Miller. A gift, you might say. All I ask in return is a small favor from your employer." He let the word hang in the air, thick with insinuation. "A right-of-way through the north pasture." "For my cattle." It was blackmail, plain and simple. He was using her poverty, her vulnerability, as a weapon against Caleb. The north pasture was the richest grazing land on the entire Stone Ranch. Granting a right-of-way would be the first step to losing it entirely. Eliza stood up, clutching Thomas to her chest. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice was steady. "My affairs are my own, Mr. Croft. They do not concern Mr. Stone." Croft laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Oh, I think they do. I think they concern him a great deal." He looked directly at Caleb. "You have a weak stone. After that, the foreclosure notice is filed, and this woman is thrown out onto the plains with nothing but the clothes on her back. We'll see how your precious arrangement holds up then." He turned and walked away, leaving a toxic silence in his wake. Eliza felt a wave of shame and despair wash over her. She was a liability. Her presence here, which had started as a gift of life, had now become a threat to the very man who had given her shelter. "I will go," she whispered, not looking at Caleb. "I will not let him use me to harm you." "You will do no such thing." Caleb's voice was a low growl, vibrating with a rage she had never heard from him before. He stepped closer, and for the first time he reached out and touched her, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. "This is not your fault," he said, his eyes blazing. "This is my fight. You are under my protection, you and Thomas." "He will not touch you." His words were a vow, a promise. In that moment, standing on the cold porch with the threat of the world pressing in on them, something shifted. The practical arrangement, the uneasy alliance, was hardening into something else entirely. Something fierce and protective, something that looked dangerously like family. That night, the house felt different. The unspoken tension had been replaced by a shared sense of siege. Silas Croft's threat lingered in the air, a poison that had forced them closer together, into a defensive circle around the child that bound them. Eliza could not sleep. She sat in the rocking chair in Thomas's room, the baby sleeping soundly against her chest, his small breaths a puff of warmth against her skin. She thought of Croft's cruel words, of the impending loss of her home, the last tangible piece of the life she had shared with her husband. It was a place of hardship and sorrow, but it had been hers. The door creaked open and Caleb stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the dim light of the hall. He had not come to her room before. "He is sleeping?" Caleb asked, his voice soft. "Yes," she whispered. "He is peaceful." Caleb walked into the room and stood by the window, looking out at the moonlit snow. The silence stretched between them, but it was no longer an awkward, empty space. It was filled with unspoken questions. "My wife Mary," he began, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. "She loved this land. She was born in a city back east. She said the sky here was bigger, that you could see the whole world and all of heaven too." Eliza listened, her heart aching for him. He had never spoken of his wife before, never once said her name. "She wanted a house full of children," he continued, his gaze distant. "She planted an orchard on the South Hill for them, apple trees. She said every child should have an apple tree." He fell silent, the weight of that lost future pressing down on him. "She died in that big bed down the hall. The doctor said there was nothing to be done. I held her hand and she just slipped away." He finally turned from the window, and in the pale moonlight, Eliza could see the glint of tears in his eyes. The sight cracked open her own carefully guarded grief. "My Daniel," she said, her own voice trembling. "He was so small. The cabin, the wind found every crack. I wrapped him in every blanket I owned. I held him against my skin all night, but he was just too new. Too fragile for this world. When the sun came up, he was cold." The story tumbled out of her, a torrent of pain she had held inside for weeks. She spoke of his birth, a lonely and terrifying affair in the dead of night. She spoke of his one short day of life, of the way his tiny hand had curled around her finger. She spoke of burying him herself, in a small wooden box her husband had made for tools, beneath a frozen pine tree. She was weeping now, silent tears streaming down her face for her lost boy, for Caleb's lost wife, for the sheer, crushing cruelty of life. Caleb crossed the room in 2 long strides. He knelt before her chair, his large, calloused hands coming to rest on her arms. He looked from her tear-streaked face to the sleeping child in her lap. "We are 2 halves of a tragedy, you and I," he said, his voice raw. "She gave him life, and you have sustained it. You are his mother now, Eliza, in every way that matters." His words were a balm on her wounded soul, to be seen not as a convenience, not as a pariah, but as a mother. It was a gift beyond measure. "Croft cannot have this land," he said, his voice hardening with resolve. "And he will not drive you from this house. This is your home now, if you will have it." It was not a declaration of love, not in the way the poets wrote about. It was something deeper, something forged in the crucible of shared loss and mutual salvation. It was a declaration of commitment, a declaration of family. "This is my home," she whispered, the words tasting of hope, a flavor she had thought she would never know again. The next morning, Caleb rode into redemption. He did not ask Eliza to join him. This was a battle he had to fight alone. He walked into the bank, a place he usually avoided, and found Croft in his office, smug and expectant. "Stone," Croft began, leaning back in his chair. "Have you come to your senses?" "I have," Caleb said, his voice cold as the winter wind. He tossed a heavy leather pouch onto the desk. It landed with a solid, metallic thud. "This is to pay off Eliza Miller's debt, in full, and for the inconvenience I am buying the note on your own failing freight company, which means, as of this moment, you work for me." Croft's face went from smug to ashen. He stared at the pouch, then at Caleb's unyielding expression, his mind scrambling to understand. "And one more thing," Caleb said, leaning forward, his hands flat on the polished desk, his presence filling the entire room. "You will never speak her name again, you will not look at her, you will not come within a mile of my ranch. If you do, the next conversation we have will not be so civil. Do you understand me?" The threat was unmistakable, backed by the full weight of Caleb Stone's power and wealth. Croft, for the first time in his life, looked truly afraid. He could only nod, his bravado utterly shattered. Caleb turned and walked out, leaving the banker ruined and humiliated. But he knew this was not the end. Men like Croft did not accept defeat gracefully. Their greed and pride would always curdle into a desire for revenge. The final confrontation came a week later, not with legal papers or financial threats, but with the raw, ugly face of violence. Silas Croft, stripped of his power and consumed by a venomous rage, was a desperate man. And a desperate man was a dangerous animal. He chose his moment carefully. It was late afternoon, the sky bruised with the colors of an impending sunset. Caleb and most of the hands were out on the far ranges, dealing with a pack of wolves that had been harassing the herds. Only Jade, the old foreman, and a handful of younger hands remained at the ranch house. Eliza was in the small orchard Mary had planted, walking with Thomas bundled against her chest. The apple trees were stark, skeletal figures against the snow, but she liked to come here. It felt like a place of hope of future seasons. She was humming a soft tune when she heard the horses. It was not Caleb. It was Croft, and he had brought 3 other men with him, hired thugs with dead eyes and guns strapped to their hips. Jade appeared on the porch of the main house, a rifle in his hands. "Croft. You know you ain't welcome here," he yelled, his voice cracking with age but firm with resolve. "I'm not here to talk to you, old man," Croft sneered, his eyes locking on Eliza. "I've come for what's mine. A man's reputation is worth something in this world. Stone took mine, I'll take something of his." His gaze dropped to the baby in her arms. "The law says that child has no mother. A rich orphan like that needs a proper guardian. Someone to manage his inheritance." Eliza's blood froze. He meant to take Thomas. The idea was so monstrous, so unthinkable that she could barely process it. She instinctively turned, shielding the baby with her body, and began to back away toward the house. "Stay where you are," one of Croft's men snarled, raising his pistol. Jade fired a warning shot into the air. "You ain't taking the boy, you'll have to go through me." Croft laughed. "That can be arranged." He nodded to his men, and they dismounted, spreading out to flank the old foreman. From the corner of her eye, Eliza saw the flash of movement. It was Caleb. He was riding over the crest of a nearby hill, a dark, avenging angel against the dying light. He had seen the riders from the range and had ridden his horse into the ground to get back. He was still 100 yards away, but his voice boomed across the snow-covered ground, a roar of pure fury. "Croft." The hired guns hesitated, turning toward the new threat. That moment of distraction was all Jade needed. The old foreman's rifle cracked, and one of the thugs cried out, clutching his shoulder as he fell to the ground. Chaos erupted. Croft, seeing his plan unraveling, spurred his horse directly toward Eliza. His face was a mask of crazed desperation. If he could just get the child, he would have his leverage. Eliza screamed and ran, her boots sinking into the deep snow, her lungs burning with the cold air. She could hear the thunder of his horse's hooves right behind her. Suddenly, Caleb's horse intercepted him, slamming into Croft's mount with the force of a battering ram. Both men were thrown from their saddles, tumbling into the snow. Caleb was up first, his face a terrifying visage of righteous rage. He launched himself at Croft, and the two men fell to the ground, trading brutal, clumsy blows. This was not a clean fight. It was a desperate, primal struggle for survival. Eliza, her heart hammering, reached the relative safety of the porch, where Jade was holding the remaining two men at bay with his rifle. She huddled behind a thick wooden pillar, her body trembling, but her arms were a steel cage around Thomas. She would die before she let anyone harm him. She watched, horrified, as Croft managed to pull a small derringer from his coat. He aimed it at Caleb, who was struggling to get to his feet. "No," Eliza shrieked. The sound of the shot was shockingly loud in the cold, still air, but it was not Caleb who fell. One of the young ranch hands, who had come running from the barn at the sound of the first shot, had thrown a heavy pitchfork. It spun through the air, and one of its tines caught Croft in the arm, sending his shot wide. Caleb surged forward, and a single, powerful punch sent Croft sprawling into the snow, unconscious. Silence fell, broken only by the groans of the injured man and the heaving breaths of the fighters. The remaining two thugs, seeing their employer defeated and the ranch hands now surrounding them, threw down their weapons in surrender. It was over. Caleb stood over Croft's limp body, his chest rising and falling, his knuckles bloody. He looked up and his eyes found Eliza. He strode toward her, his long coat covered in snow, his face bruised. He ignored the other men, ignored the scene of the fight. He walked directly to her on the porch. He reached out not for the baby but for her. His hands cupped her face, his thumbs gently wiping away the tears she hadn't realized were falling. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. "No," she choked out. "We are safe." He pulled her and the child with her into a fierce embrace, holding them as if he could weld them to his own body, protecting them from all the evils of the world. He buried his face in her hair, and she felt a shudder rack his powerful frame. The ranch hands watched in silence. In that moment, they were not looking at their boss and the hired wet nurse. They were looking at a man defending his family. The whispers and suspicions died right there, in the cold air of the dying day, replaced by a deep, unwavering loyalty. Silas Croft and his men were tied up and delivered to the territorial marshal the next day. The story of his attack on the Stone Ranch, his attempt to kidnap an infant, became a cautionary tale throughout the territory. His defeat was total, his name a synonym for greed and disgrace. He was removed from their lives forever. In his absence, a quiet peace settled over the ranch. The community's perception, fickle as the wind, began to shift. They saw the thriving child, the devotion in Caleb's eyes, the quiet dignity of Eliza. They saw a family forged in tragedy and trial, and their scorn slowly, grudgingly, turned to respect. The shadow of the past had been banished, leaving only the clean, bright promise of a new beginning. In the weeks that followed the attack, the great house on the hill began to feel less like a tomb and more like a home. The oppressive silence was filled with the gurgles and coos of a happy baby, and sometimes the low, soft sound of Eliza's laughter. Caleb found himself seeking out her company, not just for meals but for conversation. They would sit by the fire in the evenings, Thomas sleeping in his cradle between them, and they would talk. They spoke of small things, the price of cattle, the coming spring thaw, the books they had read. And sometimes they spoke of larger things, of hope, of loss, of second chances. One evening, Caleb looked around the grand living room at the dark, heavy furniture and the sad, glass-eyed hunting trophies. He saw it all through new eyes. It was a monument to a life that was over, a life he had shared with Mary. It was not a place to build a new future. "I do not like this house anymore," he said quietly, surprising even himself. "It is full of ghosts." Eliza looked at him, her expression soft and understanding. "A house is just wood and stone," she said. "A home is the people inside it." "Then let us build a new one," he declared, a sudden energy in his voice. "Smaller, on the south hill by the orchard Mary planted, a place with more windows. More light." It was a radical idea, to leave the ancestral home, the symbol of his family's wealth and power, for a simple cabin. It was a rejection of the past, a conscious step toward a different kind of life. And so they began. As the snows of winter began to melt, revealing the sleeping earth beneath, Caleb and his men started felling timber for the new house. Eliza was there every day, bringing them food and water, with Thomas strapped to her back in a carrier she had fashioned from a soft deer hide. She drew the plans herself on a piece of parchment, sketching out a cozy, practical home with a large kitchen and a wide porch that would catch the morning sun. It was not the house of a land baron, it was the house of a family. They worked side by side. He taught her how to strip bark from a log, and she showed him the best place to plant a kitchen garden. He built a sturdy new rocking chair for the porch, and she stitched curtains for the windows. It was a literal and figurative act of building their future together, piece by piece. One warm spring afternoon, as they stood on the foundation of the new house, looking down at the valley below, Caleb turned to her. He took a small wildflowers from his pocket, the first blooms of the season, and tucked it gently behind her ear. "Eliza Miller," he said, his voice serious, "I am a man of few words, and I do not have a poet's tongue. But I know what is true. My life was over. It was a long, dark winter, and I did not think I would see the spring. You and Thomas, you were the spring." He took her hand, his thumb stroking her work-roughened knuckles. "I would be honored if you would be my wife. If you would let me give you and Thomas my name and make this family real in the eyes of the world." Tears welled in Eliza's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of a joy so profound it felt like sunlight bursting through her soul. She had come to his door a beggar, a pariah, offering the only thing she had left to give, and in return he was offering her everything: a home, a name, a future, a love quieter and stronger than any she had ever dreamed of. "Yes," she whispered, "yes, Caleb, I will." Their wedding was a simple affair, held right there on the South Hill, with the half-built frame of their new home as their church. Jade stood as Caleb's witness, and the cook, a woman who had come to love Eliza like a daughter, stood as hers. The whole ranch attended, their faces filled with genuine happiness for the family that had risen from the ashes of two great sorrows. That summer they moved into the new house. It was filled with light and the smell of fresh-cut pine and baking bread. They planted the garden Eliza had designed, and its green shoots pushed defiantly through the dark soil, a promise of life and sustenance. One evening they sat on their new porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. Thomas, now a sturdy toddler, played at their feet, chasing a firefly. Caleb reached over and took Eliza's hand, lacing his fingers through hers. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture of comfortable, easy affection. He placed his other hand on her belly, where a new life was just beginning to stir. It was a final, symbolic act of healing. From the depths of winter and death, a new spring had come, bringing with it the promise of a harvest of joy. 5 years passed. The harsh Wyoming winters still came, but they no longer held the same terror. They were seasons of warmth now, of fires in the hearth and stories told in the soft glow of lamplight. The small house on the South Hill was filled with the sounds of life. Young Thomas, a curious and bright boy with his mother's dark hair and his father's steady gaze, now had a sister, a little girl named Mary, whose laughter was as bright and clear as a mountain stream. The orchard their father's first wife had planted was heavy with fruit, and the children spent their autumns chasing each other through the rows of apple trees, their pockets full. The old Grand Ranch house at the bottom of the hill stood empty, a silent monument to a time of sorrow. Caleb had offered it to Jade upon his retirement, but the old foreman had politely refused, preferring his own small, familiar cabin. The house was part of a past they had all survived, but none of them wished to live in. Their new home, the one they had built with their own hands and their shared hopes, was where their life was. It was a place of light and love, its wide porch a stage for the simple, beautiful moments that made up a life. A child taking its first steps, a shared cup of coffee at sunrise, a quiet embrace as the stars emerged in the vast, endless sky. Caleb was a changed man. The hard, stoic shell had been weathered away by love, revealing the kind, honorable man beneath. He still worked his land with the same fierce determination, but now he worked for them, for Eliza, for Thomas, for Mary. His wealth was no longer a measure of his power, but a tool to provide for and protect his family. Eliza had blossomed. The gaunt, haunted woman who had appeared at his door in a blizzard was gone. In her place was a confident, serene matriarch, her quiet dignity now a source of immense strength. She was the heart of their home, the gentle hand that guided their family. The town that had once shunned her now looked upon her with a deep and abiding respect. She was Mistress Stone, a woman whose integrity and resilience had become a local legend. One cool evening in late summer, they sat together on the porch swing, watching the children catch the last of the fireflies in a glass jar. Thomas was patient and careful, showing his little sister how to hold the jar without frightening the glowing insects. Caleb wrapped his arm around Eliza, pulling her close. "Do you remember that first night?" he asked, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "The storm." "I will never forget it," she said softly. "I thought my life was over. I thought all the light in the world had gone out." "Mine too," he confessed. He looked at their children, their small forms darting through the twilight, their laughter echoing in the peaceful air. "It is a strange thing," he mused, "how the worst day of your life can be the beginning of everything." She leaned into him, her heart full of a gratitude so immense it was almost painful. They were a testament to the idea that family was not always a matter of blood, but of choice. It was a conscious act of showing up, of standing together against the storm, of choosing to heal and build something new from the wreckage of the old. Theirs was a love story written not in flowery words, but in shared chores, quiet understanding, and unwavering loyalty. It was a story of how two broken souls, brought together by tragedy, had saved each other and created a life more beautiful than either had ever dared to imagine. The world had tried to break them, but it had only succeeded in making them stronger, their bond forged in the fires of sorrow and tempered by the simple, profound grace of a second chance. They had found their happily ever after, not in a grand castle, but in a small house on a hill, surrounded by apple trees and the laughter of their children.